State of Utah versus Tyler James Robinson. Could you state your name?
Tyler James Robinson.
Thank you for being here, Mr. Robinson.
In the quiet suburbs of Utah, a crime unfolded that would send shockwaves through families, investigators, and entire communities. This wasn't a case with an easy explanation, nor a story that could be neatly tied up in a headline. No, this was something darker, more disturbing, and at the center of it all stood Tyler Robinson, a young man who at first glance seemed completely ordinary. Yet behind that facade lay secrets no one could have imagined. When the details of his confession surfaced, they did more than just shock, they rattled even the most hardened investigators. How could someone so young, so unassuming, harbor such venom and carry it out with such chilling certainty? This is not simply the story of a murder. It's the story of obsession, of quiet resentment left to fester in the shadows until it erupted into something deadly. It's about the lies we tell others, the lies we whisper to ourselves, and the dangerous undercurrents of hate that, when ignored, can spiral into violence. Over the next hour, we'll unravel the evidence, retrace the final days, and step into the mind of a man whose choices left a community forever scarred. Before we dive into today's story, kindly subscribe to our Shadow Detective channel if you believe in fighting for justice. Kindly help us reach 300 subscribers, and we believe that with energy and support, we will achieve it. Let's build this community that refuses to stay silent, to stop asking the hardest question of all, but why? Every view, every comment, and every subscriber is a stand against silence and a step toward truth for those who can't fight for themselves. Tyler Robinson was no stranger in his community. On the surface, he blended in seamlessly, a polite young man, quiet, the kind of neighbor who might offer a nod in passing, but rarely lingered for conversation. Yet, behind that calm exterior lay a life marked by detachment. Friends described him as withdrawn, someone who seemed more at ease in the glow of a computer screen than in the company of people. His world was increasingly shaped by online interactions, chat rooms, and digital spaces where his voice carried more weight than it ever did face-to-face. But isolation alone doesn't tell the full story. At the heart of this case was a victim whose path collided with Robinson's in ways that would end in tragedy. The two were not strangers, nor were they casual acquaintances. They shared a strained connection, one built on tension and unresolved conflict. What began as minor disagreements soon grew into a simmering hostility. Friends later recalled the bitterness between them, accusations, resentment, and grudges that only deepened over time. Investigators would conclude that this was no impulsive act of rage. It was the culmination of a storm that had been building, a storm driven by personal animosity, festering conflict, and the corrosive presence of hate that steadily seeped into Robinson's thoughts. What began as tension spiraled into open hostility, and prosecutors argue it was that hostility that set the stage for a deadly outcome. On a night that began like any other, the ordinary gave way to the unthinkable. Tyler Robinson, investigators would later say, was no longer just a young man adrift in isolation. He was someone who had crossed a dangerous threshold. He armed himself with intent, his actions deliberate and precise. Nothing suggested a sudden outburst. Instead, every move hinted at calculation, as though the crime had been set in motion long before that night. The victim never saw it coming. What began as a strained relationship had escalated into an irreversible decision, one that left a family devastated and a community in shock. The confrontation turned violent, and in those moments, years of simmering hostility erupted into an act investigators would later describe as cold, calculated, and merciless. Yet what followed was perhaps even more haunting than the crime itself. Robinson didn't run. He didn't scramble for excuses. Instead, he confessed, calmly, almost casually. Detectives were struck by his composure. His admission carried no desperation, no attempt to twist the truth. Only a blunt acknowledgement, delivered with unnerving ease. This was not the remorseful outpouring of someone crushed by guilt. It was the detached statement of a man who claimed he had simply had enough. And in that moment, investigators realized this was more than a single act of violence. It was the culmination of a mindset, one twisted by resentment and left unchecked until it turned deadly. When investigators obtained recordings of Tyler Robinson's words, it wasn't the content that struck them first, it was the tone. He didn't sound frantic. He didn't sound remorseful. Instead, his confession carried an eerie composure, as though he were describing something inevitable. In one exchange, his roommate pressed him, "Why did you do it?" Robinson's reply was chillingly simple. "I had enough of his hatred. Some hate can't be negotiated out." That blunt response shook investigators. This wasn't just a young man admitting to violence, it was someone framing murder as a grim resolution to conflict. Robinson spoke with unsettling clarity, even drifting into logistics, mentioning the rifle, speculating about evading evidence, and detailing his movements like he was recounting a strategy rather than a crime. To seasoned detectives, this was more than a confession. It was a glimpse into a disturbed state of mind, one where resentment had hardened into justification, where killing wasn't viewed as a crime, but as a solution. What unsettled them even more was how freely he spoke. There were no hushed tones, no pleas for mercy, no bargaining for leniency. Robinson talked about what he had done calmly, almost clinically, as though he had already made peace with the unthinkable. For prosecutors, the recordings were damning. For the public, they were haunting. In every word, every pause, and in the unsettling calm of Robinson's voice, the community was left to wrestle with a chilling question: how could someone so young, so seemingly ordinary, descend into such darkness? With the confession in hand, investigators faced their next challenge, proving not just what had happened, but why. Words alone, no matter how unnerving, would never be enough in court. They needed evidence, and they needed it fast. Detectives turned first to Robinson's immediate surroundings. His roommate, who had overheard the disturbing admissions, became a key figure. Law enforcement handled him cautiously, weighing cooperation against suspicion. Was he truly just a bystander, or had he known more than he was letting on? Meanwhile, forensic teams scoured the apartment for weapons, electronics, and any trace of evidence that could either confirm or contradict Robinson's account. What they found painted an even darker picture. The rifle, the digital conversations, the chat logs. Robinson's online footprint told the story of a man who had slowly withdrawn into a shadowed world, one where resentment and obsession were left to fester unchecked. Piece by piece, investigators uncovered a disturbing pattern, one that suggested the crime was not only intentional, but the culmination of a mindset that had been building for far longer than anyone realized. Meanwhile, prosecutors weighed a critical decision. Should Robinson's case remain a state-level murder trial, or did the breadth of his online activity, and the possibility of wider connections, justify federal charges? Federal agents were already circling, combing through usernames, tracing conversations, and mapping out whether Robinson had acted alone or was part of something larger. Amid all this, one fact became undeniable. Robinson's calm, matter-of-fact confession wasn't a slip of the tongue. It aligned with the evidence surrounding him, the portrait of a life that had been spiraling toward violence long before that night. For the community, the investigation moved at a torturous pace. Each new detail peeled back another layer, exposing how an ordinary existence had masked something far more sinister. And as law enforcement dug deeper, one truth became clear: this was no random act. It was the product of choices, grudges, and a mindset that made tragedy feel almost inevitable. The question lingered: why did Tyler Robinson commit such a crime? It haunted investigators, psychologists, and the public alike. But the answer, as often happens in cases like this, proved to be complex. Robinson wasn't the type to explode in a single flash of rage. His anger simmered quietly, building over time. Friends recalled how he withdrew further into himself, immersed in the online worlds where hostility ran unchecked. In those echo chambers, his resentment wasn't challenged, it was amplified. Experts argue this isolation created a dangerous cycle, reinforcing the darkest corners of his thinking. But loneliness alone wasn't the trigger. The victim held a deeply personal place in Robinson's mind. Their fraught relationship, defined by arguments, insults, and festering animosity, grew into an obsession. Prosecutors believe Robinson stopped seeing his victim as a human being, instead viewing him as a symbol of everything he despised. And once that dehumanization took hold, violence became not just possible, but in Robinson's eyes, inevitable. Psychologists who reviewed the case highlighted one detail that still chills those who study it: the tone of Robinson's confession, calm, collected, detached. To them, it revealed not just guilt, but a mind that had already rationalized the act. Robinson didn't see himself as a man consumed by rage. He saw himself as someone who had acted, no matter how twisted that justification may have been. Ultimately, his motives seemed to be a toxic mix: deep isolation, festering resentment, and an inability to process conflict in any healthy way. Together, these forces created a perfect storm, one that ended in tragedy, a life stolen, a family broken, and a community forever scarred. But the case of Tyler Robinson is more than the story of one man's violent choices. It is a stark reminder of how hidden anger, left unchecked, can grow into catastrophe. It shows the dangers of isolation, the corrosive power of resentment, and the destructive path a person can walk when hate becomes their compass. For the victim's family, the pain is permanent. For the community, the memory of this crime lingers as both wound and warning. And for the rest of us, it forces a haunting question: how many lives could be at risk if we continue to overlook the warning signs? If you found this deep dive into the Tyler Robinson case compelling, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who follow true crime, and subscribe to Shadow Detective. Each week we uncover the stories that shine a light on the darkest corners of human behavior, stories that demand to be told, and lessons that must not be ignored.